Welcome back, everyone. I hope you all have the handouts, otherwise they are in the back on the desk. So it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. It's Miguel Granada from the University of Barcelona. Please.
So first, many thanks for the invitation. The title of my talk is Earth, Center of the World, and the Principle of Motion from Aristotle to Kepler. From the title of my talk, you can see that the subject of my presentation concerns so to say, the very first 5 seconds in the history of science, very far then from the discussions and questions discussed in the last century in the history of science. At any rate, I think that the subject of my intervention, if not my intervention, is historically very significant, and I hope that my presentation will be interesting, if not amusing. Well, I hope that you all have the handout with the text that will be read in the course of my talk. And I start. Aristotle presents in his treatise on the heavens, the Caelo, second book, chapter 13, a strong criticism of the Pythagorean cosmology. According to the Pythagoreans, the geometrical center of the world is the place of maximum perfection. Therefore, it must be occupied by the most important body, central fire. The Earth, like the sun, moves around this fire. As the very critical presentation by Aristotle entails, this concept of the center is marked with university. The geometrical center coincides with or is the same as the vital or natural center. It is only logical that it be occupied by the most perfect body, namely fire. To this view, Aristotle opposes a dual conception of the center. Just as in animals, the geometrical center does not coincide with the vital or natural center in the cosmos, the geometrical center, which is occupied by the Earth, can be the point of minimal perfection or maximal imperfection, while the center of nature and life, the heart of the world, although this expression is not found in Aristotle, might be located at a different place. In Aristotle's words, this is the text number 1 in the handout, we should rather suppose the same to be true of the whole world as is true of animals, namely that the center of the animal and the center of its body are not the same thing. For this reason, there is no need for them, the Pythagoreans, to be alarmed about the universe, nor to call in a guard for its mathematical center. They ought rather to consider what sort of thing the true center is, and what is its natural place. For it is that center which should be held in honor as a starting point. Okay? The local center would seem to be rather an end than a starting point. For that which is defined is the local center. That which defines it is the boundary. But that which encompasses and sets bounds is of more worth than that which is bounded. Well, that the center of nature is the heart becomes explicit in the commentary by Simplicius, the most important ancient Greek commentary to the Caelo of Aristotle. A commentary that was translated in the late 13th century into Latin by William of Verbeke and was extensively used by Thomas Aquinas in his own commentary. Commenting on this place in the Caelo, Simplicius says, this is text number 2, Aristotle gives a refutation of what is said by the Pythagoreans on the basis of the homonymy of center. Aristotle says that the argument proceeds as if center were used one way only, and there were no difference between the center relative to the magnitude and that relative to the nature of things. However, in the case of animals, these two are not the same. Rather, in the case, the center of the corporeal magnitude is that from which the magnitude in each direction is equal. The navel, for example. And the natural center is that in which what is most honorable and the starting point for being is. For example, the region around the heart, where this starting point or something analogous to it might be. In the same way, in the case of the whole cosmos, it turns out that the central point is the center of the spherical magnitude and body. But it is necessary to seek something else as the most honorable part, analogous to the heart, namely the center. And this is not the central point, but rather the fixed sphere, that is the sphere of the fixed stars, because it is the starting point of the being of the cosmos and carries around the other spheres with it and contains the whole corporeal nature. Consequently, the Earth remains at rest in the worthless geometrical center, whereas the true center, the peripheric stellar sphere, is the place from which motion departs towards the interior of the world. Thus, the stellar sphere is the first mode, or primum mobile, with the swiftest daily motion, in direct and immediate connection with the first unmoved mover, divine intelligence. In addition, it communicates its daily motion to the inferior planetary spheres. These considerations by Aristotle about the center are strongly related to chapter 10 of the same second book of the Caelo. Here, Aristotle investigates the reason of the different periods of the planets and answers that these periods are in accordance with the distance to the center. Text number three, the movements of the planets are faster or short or slower according to their distances. But which center? The geometrical or the natural? We could think on the geometrical center. Indeed, since the distance to it and consequently the radius of the circle each planet must perform is different, the planet less distant to the central Earth will have shorter period than the more distant planets. Thus, the period of the moon lasts a month, that of the sun a year, and that of Saturn 30 years. Planetary periods are then proportional to the distance from the geometrical center, assuming the planets move with equal speed. This assumption will be made by Copernicus in his Revolutionibus, Book 1, Chapter 10, in accordance with Euclid, with the theorem of the Euclid's optics. And Copernicus behaves this way because he has adopted the Pythagorean concept of univocal center, and the sun, identified with Philolaus fire, with the Pythagorean fire, is simultaneously the geometrical and the natural center. But this is not the case with Aristotle. In accordance with his concept that planetary motion must be considered in connection with its natural center or vital center, Aristotle thinks that the period is proportional to the distance of the planet from the sphere of the fixed stars. Thus, Saturn, which is the closest to the fixed stars, has the longest period in his proper earthward motion, and the moon as the farthest planet, the shortest period. For, I read text number 3b, well, 3, the second part, for each planet in performing its own revolution is going against the motion of the heaven, of the first heaven. Why this? Because the natural center, the heart of the world, the sphere of fixed stars, exercises a force. Aristotle uses the verb krateitai from kratos, that is force or power, a force diminishing with distance and therefore proportionally inverse to the distance. As a result, Saturn is more subject to, more dominated by the first sphere, or as Guthrie translates into English, text number 3, the nearest one to the sphere of the two stars is most strongly contracted by the primary motion. Accordingly, Saturn moves with its own motion more slowly. Doubtless, you are thinking that the Copernican account is simpler and easier to conceive. This is indeed one of the points showing the higher rationality and simplicity of heliocentrism. Nevertheless, it requires, for be true, Copernicanism requires that the Earth be expelled from the center of the world against the conclusions of physical science, and last but not least, mixing or confounding the elementary world with the celestial or ethereal. Let's proceed then step by step and present the geocentric setting. First section of my talk, heart and principle of motion in the geocentric tradition. The Aristotelian corpus contains a work now considered apocryphal by most specialists. It is the so-called Pericosmos, the Mundo, a work different from the Caelo, the heavens. This book, the Mundo, was considered, however, in the Middle Ages and in the 16th century, an original work by Aristotle. It is interesting to introduce this work into our inquiry now, since it gave occasion to Georg Joachim Rheticus, a disciple of Copernicus, in his first presentation and defense of heliocentrism, or of the heliocentric world system, the so-called Narratio Prima, published in Danzig in the year 1540, 3 years before the appearance of Copernicus' work. This, the Mundo, gave occasion to Rheticus to argue in favor of Copernicus from a passage in this work related to chapter 10 in Aristotelian De Caelo. Before coming, however, to the Copernican inversion as presented by Rheticus, let's see the Aristotelian argument in the Mundo. Chapter 6 of the work, Aristotle does not speak simply of the center of life or heart of the world and physical starting point of motion, that is the sphere of the fixed stars. He speaks of God as dwelling, this is text number 4 in the handout, God is dwelling in the words of the poet, Homer, on the topmost crest of the whole heaven, from where God governs the world through his power. The Greek word used by Aristotle in this case is dynamis. The power of God, the equivalent to the kratos mentioned in the Caelo, chapter 10 of the book, moves the celestial spheres with a force decreasing with distance. And I read again text number 4. The body, which is nearest to him, to the sphere of the fixed stars, most enjoys his power, the power of God. And afterwards, the next nearest, Saturn, and so on successively until the regions wherein we dwell are reached. Aristotle, however, has a further reflection absent in the Caelo, and the one that will appeal to Rheticus. How does God move the world? Does he remain in rest, or is he in motion? The answer that we can indeed connect with Aristotle's concept of God as moved over is clear-cut. Just as the king of Persia, Rheticus says Demoto, just as the king of Persia governs his immense empire at Susa or Ecbatana, invisible to all, dwelling in a wondrous palace, to an even greater extent, the government of the world from immobility is fitting to God, so that, we read again this number in the last section, it is more worthy of his dignity, of God's dignity, and more befitting that God should be enthroned in the highest region, and that his power, extending through the whole universe, should move the sun and moon and make the whole heaven revolve. So too the divine nature, by simple movement of that which is nearest to it, the first heaven, imparts its power to that which next succeeds, and thence further and further until it stands over all things. We will see later that Rheticus, following Copernicus, adapted Aristotle's text to heliocentrism, identifying the king of Persia, or most mover of the world, with the sun as God's vicar resting in the univocal center. For the moment, I only mention that most probably the Caelo, chapter 10 of the second book, is or was the starting point for an Arab astronomer called Alpetragius, for his transformation, according to which the decreasing motive force transmitted from the heart or natural center of the world produces the diurnal motion of every planet from east to west. For Alpetragius, this is the only motion in the planets, since they presumed proper motion, the motion eastwards, is only the proper motion of the planets, is only an apparent illusory motion produced by the delay of the planet because of the diminished force acting on it. Since this force is weaker in the moon than in Saturn, the delay of the moon's diurnal motion is much greater than in Saturn. As a result, it appears to our sight, it appears that the moon is moving every day faster westward than Saturn and accomplishes its own period in only a month, whereas Saturn is 30 years. In fact, Saturn, being more affected by the motive force, moves faster to the west than the moon and loses every day less space with respect to the stars than the moon. Alpetragius' model, after it was translated into Latin by Michael Scott at the beginning of the 13th century, forcefully appealed to the sensibility of natural philosophers, not astronomers, but to natural philosophers in the Latin Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, because it simplified planetary motion, removing the difficulty of accepting a simultaneous motion of the planets in opposite directions. For the astronomers, however, the fact that diurnal and proper motion were accomplished on different axes, the axis of the world and the axis of the ecliptic respectively, made this model, among other reasons, implausible. This objection, notwithstanding, Alpetragius' model was still seducing at the turn of the 17th century natural philosophers like Italy, Bernardino Telesio, Tommaso Campanella, in England, for example, Francis Bacon, as well as several astronomers. What we've seen thus far asks for the strong connection between the Caelo chapter 13 of the first of the second book and chapter 10 of this second book, and consequently between the problem of the true center or heart of the world and the principle or starting point of motion. Many authorities from the 13th century, Copernicus and beyond, could be cited on both points. I will only mention Thomas Aquinas for reasons of time. And Aquinas follows Aristotle in his own commentary on the Caelo in denouncing the error of the Pythagoreans when they conceived absolutely, that is univocally, simpliciter id est, univoque, the center, identify center of the magnitude with the natural center of the thing in question. But Aquinas, relying on Simplicius' commentary on Aristotle, is more explicit than Aristotle and calls the natural center the heart, as opposed to the geometrical center in the navel. Therefore, Aquinas says, Aristotle shows first, this is text number 5a, Aristotle shows first where is in the universe the center analogous to the heart in the animal, and says that it is the principle of the other bodies, and above all, the most honorable among the bodies, namely the sphere of the fixed stars. Accordingly, the starry sphere is the heart of the world. Previously, Aquinas has commented chapter 10 of the second book and declared that rationally, the motions, this is text, also text 5 in the handout, 5b, rationally, the motions of all the stars, planets, are faster or slower in accordance with the distance with respect to the first sphere and with respect to the Earth. Well, nevertheless, this supreme sphere is responsible, by virtue of its stronger influence, of the longer period in the proper motion of the nearer planets. And I read now text number 5b in a portion in Latin, but it is a very easy Latin. I think that we all can understand it without trouble. Well, I read, planeta autem maxime distans a suprema sfera, scilicet luna, in minimo tempore per agit circulum suum, scilicet in spacio unius mensis, in a month. Well, etiam in minori tempore. Inter alios autem planetas, propincior supreme sphere, the nearest to the most high star sphere, semper in maiori tempore circulum suum per transit. Sicut Jupiter in duodecim annis, in 20 years. Mars in 2 years, Venus, Mercurius, et Sol in anni. That is, the inferior planets have the same sidereal period around the Earth, 1 year. E sicut illus cos magis distata suprema sfera in minori tempore per transit circulum suum, quia prima sfera maxime praevalet planete sivi propinquissimo, et ex hoc motus contrarius fit tardius. The proper motion, moves with a slower velocity. Planete autem maximi distanti minime prevalet, propter eius distantiam, et ideo motus contrarius in eo est velocio scilicet in luna. Intermedi autem planete se habent secundum rationem distantiae, sicut mathematici ostendum. That is, Aristotle refers to the authority of the mathematical astronomers. Ita scilicet quod superiores planete tarius moventur in suis proprius motivus. Aquinas excludes that this retardation may be conceived as a kind of violent motion. Since heavenly motions proceed in accordance with intellect and will, there is no violence in them, although they may convey some necessity. All this clearly indicates the difficulty in conceiving the double motion of the planets in opposite directions and the uneasiness with the purely physical explanation of the force acting on the planet and counteracting its proper motion. Aquinas mentions here the solution offered by others, but PROTEUS is clearly meant, of only one motion, carrying the planets westward with decreasing speed in accordance with the increasing distance to the source of motion. The attractiveness of this elegant solution is, however, Aquinas says, overthrown by the difficulties raised by Ptolemy in the Almagest. Surprisingly, however, Aquinas comes nearer to our modern view and suggests that, I quote, suggests that the superior planet runs over its circle in more time, not because he moves slower, but because its circle is greater. This assumption of the geometrical center and therefore of the Earth as determining the ratio distance period was of no avail, since it seemed to concede to the most vile and inferior body and influence the Earth and influence and causality on the heavens. Indeed, this looked like an utterly inversion of the flux of being, always advancing from the cosmic periphery into the interior of the world, into the Earth, in the geometrical center of the Earth. The inconvenience of this wrong assumption have already been indicated by Simplicius, the commentator of Aristotle, when he affirmed in his comments on Untitled Chapter 13 of the second book, that the sphere of the fixed, I read again the text in the first page, the text number 2b, Demiurgic creativity, Simplicius says, proceeds from above, from the fixed sphere, and moves down from the heaven to the sublunary world. And here introduce higher elements which are stronger than lower ones, so that at the last it produces Earth in the central point of the universe. Only 12 years before the publication of Copernicus' De Revolutionibus, 1543, the highly influential Philip Melanchthon stressed the same view in his preface to the edition of Sacroboscos Sphera, published in Wittenberg in 1531. Explicitly appealing to Aristotle's authority, Melanchthon highlighted celestial causality and governance of inferior sublunary things. I judge, this is text number 6, I judge that Aristotle spoke rightly when he said that this lower world is governed by the higher one, and the higher things are the cause of motion in the lower ones. Melanchthon explains this role of the heavens as principle of motion with the analogy of the heart in man, thus entailing that the heavens are the heart of the world. And we read again the same text. Just as in our bodies, life, or the first motion that resides in the heart, stimulates motion in the other members, so, since without doubt the motion of the heavens is the first, it causes the other bodies to effect each their own motions. Assuredly, no one who is correctly versed in philosophy will think differently in any way. Well, we pass to the second section of the talk, the sun as heart of the world and principle of motion in Copernican heliocentrism. Copernicus knows well the Pythagorean doctrine on the central fire. He quotes it in his prefatory letter to the Revolutionibus. He quotes the description offered by Greek source, the pseudo-Plutarch. Something, Copernicus says, that the Earth remains at rest. But Philolaus, the Pythagorean, believes that, like the sun and moon, it revolves around the fire in an oblique circle. Note that Copernicus seems fully conscious that according to the letter of his testimony, the sun is not in the center, but revolves around the central fire. Nevertheless, as this motion of the earth around the fire is a revolution, Copernicus seemingly identified this fire with the central sun in his own system. And both traditional authors, contrary to the cosmological reform proposed by Copernicus, like the Italian Dominican Giovanni Maria Tolosani, and the very few realist Copernicans in the second half of the 16th century, all of them coincide in interpreting Copernican heliocentrism as a revival of the old Pythagorean cosmology. The first ones, the anti-Copernicans, to reject it as any rational attempt to revive an absurd doctrine justly refuted by Aristotle. The second ones, I mentioned Thomas Digges in England, Giordano Bruno all over Europe, and Johannes Kepler, to praise this Pythagorean dimension of Copernican astronomy as the restoration of the true cosmological worldview known to the Prisca Sapientia, to ancient wisdom, and erroneously abandoned by Aristotle. Kepler even arrived as far in his notes to his German translation of the Caelo, of the Aristotelian De Caelo, chapter 13 of the second book, as to blame Aristotle for falsely, that is, literally reading the esoteric and allegorical doctrine of the Pythagoreans, truly meaning, however, heliocentrism. I read now text number 7. In his notes to his translation, Kepler says, note 2, the Pythagoreans have spoken covertly, have understood by the word fire the sun, and with them, with the Pythagoreans, I also hold that the sun stands in the middle of the world and never leaves this place, and that, on the other hand, the earth moves once a year around the sun, that is, around the middle place of the world, as otherwise other 5 wandering stars. And in the first note to his translation, Aristotle's declaration that the revolution of the earth around the fire produces day and night. This affirmation is wrong. Aristotle has not understood the Italian wise man's opinion. Besides the fact that the earth is led around the sun, the earth also rotates, and by this rotation makes day and night. And in the text, in the note number 4, Aristotle forgot the Pythagorean way and usage, that they considered these doctrines to be a secret and talked in a confusing manner, so that no one would understand it, but only he who held himself to them. Copernicus restored, consequently, the true Pythagorean doctrine of the center, that is, the univocal concept that interprets geometrical center as the natural vital center of the cosmic organism. This unification of geometrical and vital center is not explicitly affirmed by Copernicus, at least not as explicitly as Kepler later did. Nevertheless, the Polish astronomer also emphasizes the nobility of the geometrical center and identifies it with the place of maximum perfection in the universe. Thus, in the most significant statement on cosmology in the Revolutionibus, the 10th chapter of the first book, Copernicus affirms, this is text number 8, at rest, however, in the middle of everything is the sun. For in this most beautiful temple, who would place this lamp, the sun, in another or better position than that from which it can light up the whole thing at the same time? Here, Copernicus ascribed to the sun an illuminating or optical function, whose optimal performance requires the central location. Seemingly, Copernicus didn't contemplate the possibility that the sun be also the cause or source of the motion of the planets, this motion being instead the immediate effect of the spherical shape of the celestial bodies. It was the opinion of a very significant historian of science, whose name was Alexandre Koyré. As support for this thesis, Koyré adduced that in the Revolutionibus, the sun is in the center of the world, but the center of planetary motion is not the sun itself, Sol Verus, the true sun, but the so-called Sol Medius, that is the center of the Earth's annual motion, placed in the vicinity of the sun. Though we must not forget that it was Kepler who, in the long process of constructing his celestial physics, abandoned the distinction between mean and true sun, Koyré's concept can be confronted with Copernicus' statement in chapter 10 of the first book of the Revolutionibus, according to which, this is text number 8b, as though seated on a royal throne, the sun governs the family of planets revolving around it. How is this solar governance of planetary motion to be understood? In my opinion, this is my opinion. In my opinion, Copernicus probably thought that the sun is responsible for the motion of the planets, not as an efficient cause, as later in Kepler, but as a teleological or final agent, in the same sense as in the Aristotelian mother, God, caused the motion of the celestial spheres as an object of desire. According to Metaphysics, Book 12, Chapter 7, Copernicus was probably transferring here to the sun as God's vicar, the teleological power through which God caused celestial motion in Aristotle's metaphysics. It is not to exclude that this Copernican conception is related to Rheticus' digressions in the Narratio Prima about God's governance of the world, either in motion or, as it seems more appropriate, in rest, in strong connection with the mentioned passage in Aristotle's De Mundo. I read text number 9. God, whether it, the sun, carries on this administration as God rules the entire universe, a role excellently described by Aristotle in the Mundo, or whether traversing the entire heaven so often and resting nowhere, it, the sun, acts as God's administrator in nature. This question seems not yet altogether explained or settled. The former manner of Ra, that is a Ra in rest, has been rejected, has been set aside. The later, a government in motion, adopted. My teacher, that is Copernicus, is convinced, however, that the rejected method of the sun's role in the law of nature must be revived. For he is aware that in human affairs, the emperor, the equivalent to the king of Persia in the pseudo-Aristotelian De Mundo, the emperor need not himself hurry from city to city in order to perform the duty imposed on him by God, and that the heart does not move to the head or feet or other parts of the body to sustain a living creature. Though metaphysical, the causation of planetary motion by the sun, as symbol of curve, is echoed and explicited by Rheticus when in the Narratio Prima he declares, I quote, "The sun may be said to be the source of light and motion, also the source of motion." At any rate, the stellar sphere, or the primum mobile in contemporary geocentric astronomy, cannot be, in heliocentrism, the principle or starting point of motion. In the Copernican cosmology, the stellar sphere is in rest and has no proper motion to transmit to the inferior planet. Moreover, the sphere of the fixed stars, the first sphere, again, after all stellar motions have been explained as an optical projection of motions in the Earth, the stellar sphere is placed by Copernicus at an enormous distance from the highest planet, Saturn, as implied by the absence of the annual parallax that the stars should manifest as an optical consequence of the annual motion of the Earth around the central fire, around the sun, excuse me. Therefore, the Aristotelian concept of the stellar sphere as a starting point of celestial motion is abandoned, and the sphere of the fixed stars becomes simply the place or container of all things. Moreover, voicing loudly what Copernicus had left implicit in the Revolutionibus, Rheticus declared in the Narratio Prima that the transference of all stellar motions to the Earth restored the sphere, now in rest, of the fixed stars as the first sphere, and as a consequence put an end to the never-ending process of adding new spheres without the stars after the discovery of stellar motions, precession of the equinoxes, trepidation, and so on. Heliocentrism makes possible for the first time to achieve a perfect closed representation of the universe as a system sensed between the two fixed and immovable limits, geometrical and vital center occupied by the sun and the sphere of the stars as the universal place of things. Motion unfolds in the planets in accordance with the rule, which reminds us that the order and motion of the heavenly spheres agree in an absolute system. Since daily motion really belongs to the Earth, the planets are deprived of this motion, of this diurnal motion, and left only with their own proper motion eastward, with periods of revolutions whose duration is proportional to the distance to the center of the universe, that is, to the sun. Planets closer to the sun have shorter period than more distant planets. Thus, Copernicus restored the basic or most fundamental rule in astronomy, already formulated by Aristotle in chapter 10 of the second book of the Heavens, but with reference by Aristotle to the first heaven as the dynamic and vital center and principle of the motion of the planets. The rigorous respect of this rule, a rule that geocentric astronomy cannot fulfill, as shown by the equal annual period of Sun, Mercury, and Venus around the Earth, independently of their different distance, is what entitles Rheticus to concede exclusively to heliocentrism the character of absolute system, closed system, that is, of a cosmological system closed and with internal motions governed by the rational law of the proportion between distances and periods. Copernicus states the same idea. However, when he introduced it at the beginning of chapter 10 of his first book, he does not refer to Aristotle, but to Euclid's authority. We read text number 10. The ancient philosophers wanted to arrange the planets in accordance with the durations of the revolutions. The principle assumes that of objects moving equally fast, planetary motion is equal at the same rate. Those farther away seem to travel more slowly, as is proved in Euclid's optics. The moon revolves in the shortest period of time because, in their opinion, it runs on the smallest circle as the nearest to the Earth. The highest planet, on the other hand, is Saturn, which completes the biggest circuit in the longest time. Why was Copernicus silent about Decaelo, chapter 10 of the second book? A chapter rightly declared by Bernard Goldstein the starting point for the Copernican reversal of the planetary order. I refer to a very important article published by Bernard Goldstein with the title Copernicus and the Origin of His Heliocentric System, published in the Journal for the History of Astronomy in the year 2003. According to Goldstein, Goldstein says, I think it likely that Copernicus took the distance period relationship from Aristotle as interpreted by his commentators. Goldstein's thesis has been accepted with further reasons by André Gaudu in another significant article with the title Reflections on the Origins of Copernicus Cosmology, published also in the Journal for the History of Astronomy 3 years later, 2006. According to Gaudu, I quote, the interpretation of Aristotle's Decaelo, chapter 10 of the second book, that the farthest from the Earth are the slowest and the closest are the fastest, was commonplace at Krakow, the university where Copernicus studied in the 1490s. Gaudu mentioned the influence in Krakow of a commentary to Aristotle's Decaelo by the philosopher Johannes Versor, where, I quote, following Aristotle, Versor preferred to distance from the sphere of the stars for the dynamic explanation. Copernicus very likely took the principle for granted and undoubtedly noticed that it didn't work for Mercury and Venus. Probably the reason is that the double centricity and the identification of the vital natural center with the sphere of the fixed stars have obliged Aristotle first to identify the first motion caused by this sphere as principle of motion with the daily motion of all the planets. Second, to interpret the proper motion of the planets in opposite direction as a motion with a decreasing period, in as much as the planet closer to the first sphere was more dominated by the principle of motion. And third, to assign to a plurality of unmoved mothers the proper motion of every planet. In this way, the simplicity of the rule of proportion became blurred in Aristotle by the distortion following the double centrality and the identification of the heart of the world and the starting point of motion, not with the geometrical center, but with the sphere of the fixed stars. In addition, Aristotle was obliged to introduce a plurality of unmoved mothers or intelligences, blurring still more the transmission of movement from the heart to the world. Contrastingly, all was simpler in Copernicus' heliocentrism, with its univocal center. The geometrical distance to the sun, center and earth, explain the increasing period of the more distant planets, even if the velocity was the same for all. Possibly, the fact that the causality of planetary motion by the sun was regarded by Copernicus as a metaphysical causation, explained that the speed of all the planets was the same regardless of their distance with respect to the source of motion. If the transmission of motion from the sun were purely physical, that is dynamical, Copernicus surely would have felt obliged to contemplate a diminution with distance of the moving force, and consequently to conceive the speed as increasingly slow upwards. This was precisely the train of thought of Kepler since his first beginnings in Tübingen in the early 1590s. We pass to the third section, the sun as head of the world in Kepler, and dynamical source of planetary motion. In a very significant letter, 10 minuti. In a very significant letter of March 1605, Kepler replied to Aristotle's objection to an unified center and said, this is text number 11, since the world is not only spherical spatially, but spherical by nature, and the world received this figure, therefore, the geometrical center of this spherical body is also the center of nature. If the animals, Kepler says, if the animals that Aristotle adduces as an example could be round, they would certainly have the head at the center. Accordingly, since the unified center is the noblest place in the body, Kepler concludes more neatly in his commentary to Aristotle than in this letter of 16, and earlier later of 1605, that in the world, this place belongs without contest to the sun, now explicitly called the heart of the whole world. And we read in text number 12, a note to his translation to Aristotle's De Caelo, since the sun is also the principal part of the whole world, the very heart and seat in which the life of the world naturally consists, together with the light which is the ornament of the whole world, therefore the center of the world belongs to it, to the sun. Certainly not so that it may be protected, as the Pythagoreans assert, but so that it may evenly distribute its force, the word used in German by Kepler is Kraft, throughout the world constantly. The identification of the heart of the world with the sun has taken place very early in Kepler's intellectual career. We find it, as well as the connection with God, already in his first preserved cosmological draft, where Kepler had adopted heliocentrism in his 1593, very young, student disputation. Here, Kepler said, a text that was never published in Kepler's time. It was only published in the edition of the works by Kepler in the 19th century. But Kepler said, in the first place, this test number 13, in the first place, not even a believing man would deny that of all bodies in the universe, the most superior is the sun, called the king of planets as regards motion, the heart of the world in strength, in which we would all judge to be the one worthy thing with the best and greatest God, if he would delight in a corporeal whole, it could be held in a place good inamid with the blessed angels. Observe that just as Aristotle had identified in the sphere of the fixed stars the point of contact, God as first mover with the sensible world and the starting point of motion, Kepler placed all this in the sun as the natural and only center, that is the heart of the world. Kepler restates this heliocentric reinterpretation of the prime mover, viewing the sun as the source of the force moving the planets in periods proportional to distances. And we read again test number 13b, since it is not appropriate for the prime mover to be spread out spherically, the sphere of the fixed stars, but rather to go forth from one certain source, as if from a point, no part of the all, and also not even any star in the order of the stars, is worthy of so much honor. It should most justly go to the sun, which alone in both worthiness and strength seems suitable and deserving of this manufacturing of motion, and which could hold even God himself, not to mention the prime mover, from which consequently the ratio of the speed of the planet can be easily devised. From the point there, undoubtedly from the common center of the sun and the world, motion standing itself most equally into all neighboring orbs makes an impression into them with equal effort and hastens the particular revolutions accordingly in proportions to the circuit. This is the starting point of Kepler's program, only closed through the Mysterium Cosmographicum in 1596 and the Astronomia Nova of 1609 with the Harmonica Mundi of 1619. Well, I omit some passages for reasons of time approach to my conclusion. You can read the text in the following section in the handout. I come to the conclusion and say that, like in living beings, there is always an intermediary between the soul and the body, that is the heart. The same occurs in the world. That is, Kepler used also the analogy macrocosmos, microcosmos, that gives to this analogy a completely different interpretation. The same occurs in the world. Here in the world, the sun in the center is the heart. Intermediary, like an instrument between God and the body of the world, to which the sun imparts movement, just as the soul does to the body of the animal through the heart as its instrument. That is, God is the soul of the world. Like in Aristotle, God is the ultimate source of motion. God gives, however, the motion to the heavenly bodies, the planets, through the sun, which rests unmoved in the true and unique center of the world, as his visible expression. And to conclude very quickly, in his Tübingen dissertation of 1593, Kepler had granted only to the sun the dignity and center, the dignity of center and heart. No part, Kepler has said, of the stellar orb, and also not even any star, is worthy of so much honor. This clear affirmation is related to the belief in Kepler in a necessarily finite universe, where the stars form the external circumference and the central sun is the greatest body in the universe. No star is, for Kepler, comparable to the sun. If we accept, however, against Kepler, that the sun is a star, not different in magnitude and dignity from anyone else, the other stars will be also suns and will be centers surrounded by planets and forming planetary systems. Every star will be centered and held. And if we accept that the universe is infinite, every sun, every planet, every point in the universe will be the center of an organism whose periphery, accordingly, is nowhere. Thus, the famous Hermetic definition of God as en infinita sfera, cuius centrum est ubique circumferentia tamen nullibi, that is, God is an infinite sphere whose center is everywhere and the circumference nowhere. This definition of curve can be applied also to the universe as God's expression. Every point in the universe will be center, and here shows therefore of a circular expansion. At this moment, we shall have passed to the infinite and omnicentric universe of Giordano Bruno, and to a very different development of Copernicanism. Many thanks for your attention.
Okay, so we have time for a couple of questions. Barbara, and then you.
No? Yeah, okay. It's interesting at the very end what you said, that in some sense Kepler keeps so much Aristotelian thinking about this. We need an intermediate. It's now not the fixed stars, it's the sun, but we still have this idea that in order to get from, well, it's the unmoved mover or God, something that's not physical, to the physical, we need a physical body that is very special, has a very special dignity, and it's the sun or the fixed movement. So it's interesting that the stuff about the closer planets being faster and the further out being slower, that's already in Plato there. And I'm a bit surprised that Kepler didn't take it up from the Timaeus, because he takes up other stuff from the Timaeus. But I've two questions, just wondering on Aristotle. The one is in Physics 8 and also in the Metaphysics Lambda, but most clearly in Physics 8, Aristotle makes it clear that the unmoved mover has to be situated at the edge of the universe, but it's completely unclear why. Sorry? It's completely unclear why the unmoved mover has to have a location, given that it's just the thinking of itself, right? So do you have any ideas on that? Because I found this always very puzzling, that we actually get a location for something that's itself not spatially extended. And the other thing is, you mentioned Thomas actually saying, well, the reason why the outermost planets are slower is just because they have a longer distance to go, a bigger circle. And it's interesting that Aristotle doesn't jump on that. Aristotle has this whole stuff about, oh, the outermost ones are closer to the unmoved mover and therefore strongly affected, and therefore, yeah. So do you have any thoughts, idea why Aristotle doesn't take that point also that we find in Thomas? That seems a very natural one.
Well, for the first question, well, I didn't mention Plato's Timaeus. Kepler knew very well Plato's Timaeus. He had read Plato, Timaeus, also the commentary by PROTEUS, etc., very, very attentively. And I only spoken of the contrast with Aristotle, because it seemed to me to be more clear, now clearer for my prospect. But concerning the question of the structure of the universe and the relation of planets, the question of planetary motion, the position of Plato's was not very different from that of Aristotle. And well, you posed also the question of the place of the unmoved mover. Well, Kepler, in a very important chapter in his work, De Caelo, the chapter 9 of the first book, says that the substances being there on the topmost surface of the universe are not in place. Are not in place. That is, the mothers being intelligences without matter, without body, cannot be in any place, because place for Aristotle is always a question related to a corporeal substance. It is, a place is the interior surface of the containing body. Accordingly, if a purely intellectual substance, a pure act without matter, no, has not a place, no, it cannot be located. Accordingly, properly, the prime mover is not beyond the surface, the external surface of the fixed stars, but it is from them where the motion starts in the universe, because the primum mobile is affected by the prime mover. By the prime mover, teleologically, as Kepler, as Aristotle states in the Metaphysics, no, chapter 7 of book Lambda, as an act of desire. No? God, the prime mover, moves as an object of desire. Accordingly, there is the difficulty of conceiving how this relation between the moving intelligence and the moved sphere can be conceived. But there is one relation that cannot be interpreted purely as a physical causation, but as a teleological causation. This is yes. In book 8 of the physics, the relation is more conceived in terms of a physical causation. That's true, in terms of a physical causation. And this is a difficulty of conception that we observe throughout the whole tradition, in the sense that, for example, the transmission of the diurnal motion to the planets from the sphere of the fixed stars cannot be conceived as a violent motion, although it is called motus raptus. It's called motus raptus, that is a motion caused by an attraction. And for this reason, there is always a difficulty in the geocentric tradition of conceiving the transmission of knowledge from the first spheres to the inferior spheres, as well as to conceive how the two movements of the planets, diurnal towards the east and the periodic movement around towards the west, towards the east, excuse me, can be produced at the same time. The difficulty to conceiving how a body must or can be moved in opposite directions at the same time. And it was for this reason that the Arabic proposal by Alpetrugi or Alpetragius of only one motion, of only one planetary motion towards the west, was the only motion in the world, because the proper motion of planets towards, contrarily to the diurnal motion, was an illusion caused by the delay caused in the inferior planets, because the force acting on them was progressively inferior. I don't know if I answered to your questions.
One last question, and
Okay, so it was going to be a two-part, so I'll ask the first part. I was wondering if in any of these discussions you ever encounter mentions of Aristotle's Demoto Animalium, because it has a very relevant discussion. So he starts by defining the motion of animals and say that they must have a point at rest at the heart, but then he goes on to say, and this is true for the entire universe as well. So he makes that analogy. And I've seen it in cosmological texts in Arabic and Hebrew and early Latin, but I was wondering if that still exists in later Latin.
Well, I haven't understood quite well. Can you translate it into Italian?
I honestly missed the last part. Can you repeat?
So if they ever mention Aristotle on the motion of the animals, because it has exactly that discussion. And when you see these discussions in Arabic and in early Latin, they often mention that fact.
The motion of the animals. The movement of the animals, whether they discuss it together.
Yes, in the Demoto Animalium, certainly true. Aristotle also speaks of the distinction between purely geometrical center and natural or vital center. It is another source of this distinction. And Aristotle applies it in this chapter of the Kepler, of the second book of On the Heavens, applies it also to the universe, using the analogy macrocosmos and microcosmos. And well, we find it also in the peripatetic tradition along the centuries. I haven't studied this connection with the Demoto Animalium closely, but the correspondence is very clear. It also finds place in the tradition. At this moment, in Copernicus, no. And in Kepler, at this moment, I cannot say, I don't remember it. I don't remember it, but in the text I've most used for this presentation is translation of the of two chapters of the Caelo, translation into German of two chapters of the Caelo, chapter 13 and 14 of the second book. If I am not mistaken, he does not mention the Demoto, but it would be very possible that Kepler also introduced this second Aristotelian. The significant point is that Kepler attempted to translated these two chapters of the Caelo in a precise point in his career. It was a program developed by Kepler. Immediately afterwards, Galileo published Desiderius Nuncius. Desiderius Nuncius obtained diffusion in the whole European scene. And Kepler undertook this translation of German with a commentary, with a running commentary to Aristotle, in order to give also more public expression favorable to Copernicus, even if he firstly was reluctant towards towards posing the Copernican question into the public debate. He was of the opinion that scholars necessarily were to act with prudence and debate this issue in among them, not in the public sense. Okay.
Okay, let's thank our speaker again.